Hello darlings, it's me Liz, and I wanted to come on here today just to do like a quick little video to kind of help out with something that I saw people were having a problem with. So I was following a comment thread and somebody mentioned that when they looked at certain palettes, they just didn't see it. It was overwhelming. They kind of didn't get, they didn't understand how to break down a palette to maybe get some inspiration, and I thought I might help with that a little bit, and just some things that have helped me. So let's talk about a palette, okay? So for instance, we're just gonna use this one as an example because I have it in front of me. When I look at a palette, like a color story on a bigger palette, this is not a huge palette, but when I'm looking at a bigger palette and I'm just kind of not feeling inspired, I actually try to break that palette down into smaller sections. So I might look at this palette, right? It's a beautiful palette, but if I'm not understanding or whatever, now this palette is laid out really different, but for me, what I like to do is I like to break the palette down into smaller sections or break it down into quads. So for instance, on this palette, I can break down and I can say I can break it down into rows, and I know that I can create cohesive looks with those rows. Does that make sense? So here we have that, or you can break it down into this row or this row. Now, if you're feeling like, you know, this palette's laid out a little bit different, but in a lot of palettes, you can break it down into rows and you'll have a cohesive look, okay? It really depends on the palette. For instance, when I look at a Nomad palette, okay? So let's look at this one here. So I have the Nomad Harvest, like their fall palette in front of me. So this is like a beautiful, like neutral palette, but some people are like, oh, well, I'm just kind of overwhelmed by the colors. I'm not really sure where to start. I like to break Nomad palettes down into 9-pan palettes. So if you cover that 6 on the side, you have a 9-pan palette that's all really cohesive. And I feel like this color story, the 9-pan, is a lot easier to make a look out of than this one. You can do the same thing on the other side. So you can make a look out of this one, and it's a completely different vibe. You could also break it down by row. Now, something like this may not look cohesive, you know, to you, but maybe 4 of those colors would work together. But for me, like for Nomad palettes specifically, I like to break them down into 9 pans. And this isn't the only palette that works this way. Let me show you. So I have the Fire and Ice palette in front of me. This palette here, you know, and somebody who isn't a color lover might, you know, look at this and be overwhelmed, but I break it down into a 9-pan, or even take it a step further and you can break it down into a 6-pan. So when you break things down into a smaller section, it makes it a lot easier to kind of see a more cohesive look if you're struggling with that. Same thing goes, like this might be harder, but this might, you know, change the game for you. So that's what I like to do. It's just kind of break it down into smaller sections. Now, some palettes you're not going to be able to do that with for whatever reason, like the way they're laid out, it just doesn't work. And you know, unfortunately, those are the trickier palettes to try to make looks from because they're not that way. Like for instance, this palette here, right? You look at this and it's a rainbow palette and you're like, wow, that's really pretty, but I'm overwhelmed by the sheer volume of greens in it, right? Boom. Now it's like a little mini palette. Okay, well, this is more manageable, or like this way. It's more manageable, right? So I like to break the palettes down into smaller sections just because that's what helps me. Now you can also break the palettes down into quads. So for instance, if you have like a palette like this, like a large palette, right? And this one's a little bit trickier, but you can look inside this palette and you can go, okay, well, not all of these are gonna work together, but maybe, you know, maybe these ones right here, that little quad right here, these 4, maybe those work well together. Or maybe these work well together, like these 4, okay? Or these 4 is a perfect little quad. So you can look inside a palette, what these would make a beautiful look right here. Or let's see, even, I know because it's tricky. So even something like this might make a nice quad. So breaking it down into quads or into rows, because you know, you can always just do all the blues or purples or greens, you know what I mean? So breaking it down into a smaller section just kind of helps when you're not really feeling inspired or when you're feeling overwhelmed when you look at a palette. Big palettes in general can be really overwhelming, but I just find that if I'm up to the challenge of using them that day, then breaking them down into quads or into rows just kind of helps me. So I just wanted to share that because I saw, you know, somebody was really struggling in the comments. And I was like, I got this. So have a beautiful evening. Have the day you deserve. And I hope this helped you. And if it helped you, please just let me know in the comments below. Like, you know, I don't have a stupid amount of tips, but that's something that I found has really helped me. So have a great night, and I will see you guys later. Okay, bye.